You still hear me, right?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode number 29 of the Raw Man Podcast. Today we are interviewing Neil Carter, who is representing Recovering from Religion. Neil, I don't know what happened to my co-hosts. I sent messages out to both of them. I guess they're out partying on the town. I don't know how you do that, how people do on the Eastern Seaboard. I guess they're just that way.
Yep.
Okay. Am I going to see you this weekend? Are you going to be in Pennsylvania?
Not going to make it to this one. I'll be at the next one at ApostaCon.
Okay. Well, I'll see you next week then.
Yeah.
All right. So Recovering from Religion, what's that about?
Well, it's a pretty descriptive name. A lot of people didn't grow up with any kind of strong religious background, but people like me, we grew up very, very Southern Baptist or Catholic or Pentecostal or some other such thing. And a lot of times when you come out of a religious background, you've got a lot of baggage. There's a lot of relationships that are affected by your leaving. And so what happens is we are there, Recovering is there to help people work through some of that baggage and kind of navigate the relationships and the changes that come from leaving their religion.
Okay, now by baggage, I read one of your articles when you were talking about that, and we have a personal story like that too. When my wife became involved with me, she was coming out of a religious, her family, her friends, her co-workers, everything. They all kind of ostracized her just because she accepted evolution as a thing.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah,
Evolution.
and it had to be extreme. There's this dichotomy. You have to either accept creationism and reject science, or if you're going to accept evolution, then you have to be atheist.
Right.
And that's the line that they drew, and they kind of forced it on her.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that. And it kind of surprised me because the church that I grew up in would call itself evangelical instead of fundamentalist. Of course, very few people actually call themselves fundamentalist. That's a word that people reserve to refer to other people, somebody who's farther on the limb than I am. That's what fundamentalist means.
Well, fundamentalist used to mean the same thing that evangelical does until 9/11.
Yeah, something around that time. But they really believe the same things. And so I grew up with that mindset, but nobody really talked about evolution much. It wasn't a central focus of our church because if there's any difference between an evangelical and a fundamentalist, it's stylistic. They believe the same things, like the inerrancy of the Bible. They believe that women shouldn't be in charge of things. They have a lot of the same beliefs, but an evangelical is sometimes a little bit more subdued and more subtle about their beliefs. So what I discovered is a lot of evangelicals don't believe in evolution. They just never talked about it much because that just wasn't their style. But what happens is if you openly challenge it and begin teaching science, then all of a sudden the resistance starts happening. And I discovered that even in my own family. When I was sitting at dinner while I was making dinner one night and I was watching the Nye ham debate.
Yeah.
One of my children walked by and saw that was on, and she saw Bill Nye. She's like, "Oh, there's Bill Nye," because they know Bill Nye. And she stopped to listen for just a few minutes, and she said, "Oh, so is he defending evolution?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Well, that's disappointing." And so I had to ask her, "Well, what do you mean?" And then that led to a long conversation. And over the next few months, I showed her every episode of Cosmos, which she loved. But point is, she had apparently been indoctrinated at her church, because she still goes to church, to believe that evolution is bad. So apparently she did have at least a few teachers that talked that way.
Yeah, my kids went to a church, well, my daughter went to a church once upon a time where they taught that dinosaurs never existed.
Yes.
And it's interesting when you get inside people's heads on all of this too, because I made the mistake of thinking that everybody knows and understands all the same things that I know and understand, because I realized early on that if I ever talk like somebody doesn't know something that I know, and then it turns out that they do, well, then I look stupid. So
then they're insulted, I guess.
Yeah, and so that the better thing to do is to simply assume that everybody else knows and understands everything that I know and understand. And if it ever happens that they don't, well, then maybe I can feel so good about myself if I'm that kind of person. But at least I can explain it to that other person. At least I don't come off looking like a jerk.
Right. Well, and you're familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you've heard that there is another side to Dunning-Kruger. Usually when we talk about it, we talk about how it means that people who are not very well informed are also not well informed about the fact that they're not well informed. so they're not aware of the fact that they don't really know very much. But the opposite side of Dunning-Kruger is that people who do know more than other people around them are often unaware that the other people around them don't know as much as they do. There's an assumption that other people are at the same place you are, and they know the same things you know. So people who are very well informed and widely read and very well educated, they often find themselves thinking the other people know things that they don't know. It's the other side to Dunning-Kruger.
Yeah, so like, for example, I just accepted that everybody in my family, I don't bring it up and we never talked about it, but I just expected that everybody in my family knew the same stuff that I did, and of course accepted the same facts that I did.
Right.
And when I finally did mention evolution, in perspective to somebody that doesn't accept, I can't believe that there are still people like this in this day and age. I'm talking to somebody in my family who doesn't, and she's shocked that I don't know that she doesn't believe any of that.
Because she assumed everybody was the same way?
Oh, yeah. She
Sure.
she let me grow up my whole life thinking that I agreed with her, and we just never talked about it. No, couldn't be any further apart.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a funny thing. When my mother was arguing with me about evolution at this one point, and I know I can prove the point, but I don't know where to begin with her, because there's nothing you can say that would ever prove anything to somebody who's insistent on never having anything proved.
Right.
It's like that guy that famously said that, if the Bible said that 2 + 2 = 5, he would just believe that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's certain things that you can argue about you can't really conclusively prove. But if you're talking about math, that is conclusive proof.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So here we have a case where you can absolutely prove that the Bible is wrong, if the Bible actually said that. Mm-hmm. And the guy's confessing that he would still believe it anyway, even if you can prove that it's wrong. So it's a mm-hmm. difficult argument. So I get into it with my mom, and she gets frustrated about it. She goes down to her church. Now, she happens to be Mormon, and Mormons don't usually take a hostile position toward evolution. So she's complaining mm-hmm. to somebody at her church that I'm trying to get her to understand evolution, and somebody put pat her on the back and say, it's okay to believe in evolution.
It's okay. You'll permit it.
Yeah. So she comes home and tells me, not kidding about this, she comes home and she tells me, I believe in evolution now. What is it?
Oh, gosh.
So then when we get into the discussion about what it is, she wants me to explain it to her. And I said, well, it would be better if I just know where the weaknesses are in your position, and then I can correct whatever, So you give me your idea.
Yeah, you start with what you know, and let's build from there.
Exactly. So she said that her perspective of evolution was that a bunch of molecules gathered together to make a man, and a separate bunch of molecules gathered together to make a fish.
Aha. Right. That's almost like a creationist version of evolution. That's really weird. Like they were each made according to their own kind. That's weird.
Yeah, and all the pictures that she saw about, the progression of apes toward men, somehow that just gets shoved right off the table. That's not even a part of that anymore.
Right. I'm guessing at the time she saw those graphics, she was taught not to believe those things, because I'm pretty sure there's been an evolution of belief among Mormonism about that detail. There certainly has been among Baptists.
So that today there was a new hominin discovered in South Africa, or it was discovered 2 years ago, but just announced today. Mm-hmm. And of course, Answers in Genesis and a bunch of the creationists are up in arms trying to find how can we object to this? How can we minimize or ridicule this or dismiss it and make it go away?
Right.
So here's a belief system where, and Ken Ham, running Answers in Genesis, has admitted to this before, that he will reject any and all evidence however he needs to in order to preserve his precious belief. It really is make-believe. So they need to come up with an excuse. They know in advance that they need to dispute any actual fact, that any real truth, they need to dispute that so that they can believe what they want to believe mm-hmm. instead. Mm-hmm. So that's the part of the fundamentalist or evangelical belief system that I'm absolutely at a loss for.
Right.
That there's no importance over whether what they believe has any connection to reality at all.
Well, it's the way faith works. Faith is, I know Peter Boghossian often refers to faith as an epistemological stance, and that's not the way they think about it, but it is an accurate way to talk about it from a certain perspective, because it's a stance about how to process reality. And it's a belief system that says that you're supposed to be told what to think, and you're supposed to believe that over what your eyes see. That the empirical observation can be wrong because the world is distorted and messed up and marred by sin. So, and as are our faculties, our mental faculties. So I know from my Reformed seminary training, they talked about this thing called the noetic effects of sin, which means sin is supposed to affect the whole person, including the mind. So if you use your mind to reason your way through the world and you arrive at a conclusion that's contrary to what the Bible says, which is divine revelation, you have to go with what the Bible says, because your mind is fallen and can lead you astray. Even if the logic seems to line up, it's not trustable because you're fallen, which is why presuppositionalist apologetics, like the man whose name shall not be named that came to Memphis.
Thank you.
He has that same system in place, and he uses a very lowbrow version of it, incidentally, but it's the same basic concept. You don't trust what reason tells you because your reason is fallen, and you have to go with what the Bible says.
Even when the Bible contradicts itself, or even when you can't distinguish between the allegory and what is supposed to be literal, and even when the literal translates it differently, like in places where you have, there's mention of this, a parable, or not a parable, but it's a colloquialism. We're talking about eating of the fruit of this, or this will be the fruit of. Mm-hmm. Now, anytime that the Bible brings that up, it's an allegory anywhere throughout the Bible, except in Genesis. That's the only time when the fruit of actually becomes a real fruit from a real tree that you could cut down and build a canoe out of.
Which seems really arbitrary. Yeah, but of course, if you challenge the accepted interpretation of the Bible, there's a tendency to say, you don't have a right to do that, because remember, you're fallen. So you don't have a right to do that. And what they never compute is that the people who have interpreted it before you and have told you how to interpret it correctly, they're supposed to be fallen too. And come to think of it, the people who wrote it are supposed to be fallen also. And some magic is supposed to have taken place whereby for all other acts of men, they are fallen. And this concept of the noetic effects of sin means you can't trust human beings at all, except when it comes to writing the Bible. Now we have to trust them. And so somehow or another, their formula breaks down at the point of the Bible, because men wrote the Bible and they admit that, but they have to do this funny sleight of hand where they swap it out and say, yeah, but God wrote it, but men wrote it, but God wrote it. So it's different.
Yeah, well, I like the rationalizations about the way they put that, like the way Dr. Paul Meyer describes how the Bible was pieced together. He attributes it entirely to the arbitrary decisions of committees of men choosing, by a vote, what goes in and what stays out. And then I got into an argument with this other guy about Matthew, and the contradiction about who owned the land that Judas died on and how did he die, and so when you get into the conflict of the two different stories, where when one version Jesus or Judas keeps the money and buys the land, and the other one he throws the money back, and then the Pharisees buy the same land, right, and then he dies two different ways. Well, I get this guy pinned in this argument, and he's explaining to me, well, this is just a different person's perspective because it's two different authors. They had a different perspective on it, so they saw it in two different ways. And I said, yeah, thank you for admitting that it was a contradiction. Men. Two different men wrote this, right, and that's why there's this contradiction.
Right.
Thank you for not telling me that God is contradicting himself. This is actually a book written by men.
Right.
And
they can admit that, but then, like I said, when it comes to then talking about how the Bible can make mistakes, they're like, oh, no, that's different. They just can't really explain how it's different.
I have to wonder, I'm being completely serious about this. I have a hypothesis that at least on some level, all these religious believers know that they're full of shit. I mean, that because, and the reason that I say this is because when I make a challenge that I can prove, for example, evolution, something easy, mm-hmm, right? They abstain. They run away from that challenge. I've seen people plug their ears and close their eyes, and I've seen people flee the room, mm-hmm, for this kind of challenge, mm-hmm, because they don't want to know what's really true, and they don't want to. They certainly don't want to find out that what they already believe isn't that. So they duck out.
All right, I have my own interpretation of that. My theory on that is that they have been taught really, really well and really thoroughly, probably from their grandmother's knee, that you cannot trust your own judgment. And they've also been told that some of these arguments that you're presenting to them are, their temptations, their distractions sent by the devil and his minions to try to pull them and lead them astray. So combine that with not trusting their own judgment. I think when they are closing their ears and running from the room, it's not because they know that they're wrong. It's because they so deeply distrust their own ability to detect error in their own thinking and in what they've been told. They don't trust themselves because they've been taught not to trust themselves. So the moment they feel themselves getting ready to question what they believe, they feel that something is wrong and they have to get away from it, not because they know the belief is wrong, but because they think they're going to succumb to something that's, off limits.
Well, I have been told by friends that if I begin to seem to make sense, it's only because the devil is speaking through me, and he is the Lord of lies.
Absolutely. And the devil, he comes as an angel of light, it says, and so do all of his people. So yeah, it's a weird, crazy belief when you really think about it, but you can't talk them out of it. Somebody said you can't reason people out of something they weren't reasoned into in the first place. I think we can still dance around the outside in the circumference and talk about things and make them ask questions, but no, I mean, for some of these things, they just have to fall back on, well, I have to believe this because it's what God said. So even if it doesn't look right to me, I have to accept it anyway.
Yeah, well, it's obviously a complete mystery to me, and I don't understand what the appeal is.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm being completely sincere about that. I mean, what aspect of any religious belief actually holds an appeal? Why? But all these people tell me, I mean, I've had many people tell me that, that they may start by saying that they're completely objective in their beliefs and they're willing to hear all my arguments or what have you. But, in a few cases, it won't be a moment later before I get some admission that the opposite is true. And one guy said that, for example, after saying that he was completely objective, he then told me a minute later that he would rather take a bullet in the ear than give up his faith.
Wow.
Which does so much for your objectivity.
Right. I just think that people are taught from such a young age to distrust themselves. To me, that's the core of all of it. It all begins with this very, very low view of human nature. So,
but why is that appealing to people?
It doesn't have to be appealing. It just has to be beaten into you from the time you're very, very little. Or that's not even the right word, because the people who do it well don't beat it into you. The people who beat it into you, that's going to backfire because people grow up hating the things that are beaten into them. The really smart people are the ones who know how to package it and make it beautiful and put it into pretty little songs that you teach to your children from the time that they can learn to sing. Those are the ones that are doing it effectively. You teach children to love these things and to feel at home in the mentality that says that you're an awful person. There's ways to spin it to make it look almost romanticized. And people that grow up in that mentality, they just learn to think that way. Because I know I internalized that. I still struggle sometimes with a super low view of myself. I've worked my way out of a lot of it, but I remember what it's like. So I understand why you talk about appeal. It's not so much about appeal. It's just that if you start people young enough, it normalizes it for them. It normalizes that super low view of themselves and that distrust of self, and they just grow up with it. It's like the background. It's like the water that they swim in. After a while, they don't even think about it anymore. It's just their whole world.
Well, maybe I should be asking you about that background experience then, because I don't have it.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people who were former fundamentalists who have very little patience for me because I have, and I'm not criticizing the people that were former fundamentalists and who don't have patience with it because they're justified. I don't have any empathy for their situation. I can't relate what it was like to believe the kinds of things for the reasons that they do. I've got no point in there at all.
Right. Yeah, I understand pretty well. And I think it's because, I didn't grow up with the, I kind of think of it like there's two kinds of fundamentalism. There's kind of the, for the lack of a better way to put it, a rural version and an urban version. The rural version tends to be the kind you see on TBN, or some other, whatever version Kim Davis has probably, given to displays of just gushy sentimentality. But there's also a highbrow version of it. It's a lot more sophisticated. It's got a much higher education level, and it says the same things, but it spins them a little bit more adeptly. It knows how to package the same ideas, but to couch them in more intelligent language. So you're saying the same things, but just with a bigger vocabulary. And instead of making a point by quoting a Bible verse, you'll make the same point by quoting a university study. And now you look like you're, appealing to a more intelligent bunch because that's your target audience. But it's just a repackaging of the same idea. And I grew up with that. So the kind of fundamentalism that I grew up with was a much more sophisticated one than you usually see coming out of like Pat Robertson's mouth and that sort of thing. I find it easier to reject that kind of thing because that wasn't my background. The harder thing to parse through is that highly nuanced, really well articulated, romanticized version of fundamentalism. And that's, to me, what evangelicalism is, and that's what I grew up in. I know that one really well.
Well, I'm curious about that because in my experience, I thought that Pat Robertson, being the CEO of so many different multi-million-dollar corporations, I thought he was the highbrow. And I argued with somebody from Liberty University once, somebody who was a minister of some sort from Liberty University, and I asked him, "Can snakes talk?" And the answer seemed to me that there's no way a guy could answer this way and not know that his answer is full bullshit. Because he said that if you believe that there's a God who can do anything that you want, and if you believe in miracles, then you believe there's a possibility that a snake can talk. What that answer translates to in my head is no, snakes can't talk, and I know that, but I'm not going to admit it.
But magic. There's always magic. It's magic. Once you allow for miracles, whether or not you have to see them to believe them, anything's possible, right? Anything is possible with God, the Bible says. So it's got a talking donkey in one place, it's got a talking snake in another, and you're just taught to believe these things, and you create a category in your head that your reasoning capacity stops at that point. And once you get above this line into the spiritual things, your logic is not supposed to operate up there. It's like a different level. It's a different story of the building where the different rules apply. So once you get there, I call it the Twilight Zone sometimes. Once you get up to that level, you have to throw all the rules out the window, which of course is essentially special pleading. It's almost like special pleading is the rule for that level. Mm-hmm. And when you get there, nothing has to make sense anymore. You can have a God who is, able to actively torture millions or billions of people, but loves them. And then you also can have the belief that, God is three people, but really one person at the same time.
And it's one person who talks to himself and asks himself for permission to do things that he needs to give himself permission to do.
Right. This doesn't make sense on the level where most of us live, but they create this other level that says, you know what, none of the rules apply at that point. So you just learn to just accept that. And there's verses that go with it too, like the secret things belong to the Lord. That's a Bible verse. And then, of course, the one you hear quoted a lot is his ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. So they just shut down when they get to that part and say, you know what, you're not supposed to understand those things. That's for the Lord to know.
That's what I got a lot of when I was a little boy. I got, how dare you question the will of God? Or how dare you question God at all? Because I think I was 8 years old when they were telling me about turning water into wine. And I said, okay, how does two hydrogens and an oxygen become a fructose alcohol?
Oh, you're doing it wrong. See, because if Jesus created everything, then he can create wine ex nihilo. Boom, right there.
Importantly, I mean, when my son, when he was like 5, he had realized that people are telling him stories about this whole religious thing. So he got me in a hallway and he looked around to make sure that nobody was in earshot. And he asked me down under his breath, he says, "Dad, how does God just make stuff?" And I knew what's going on in his head, because I've been there, right? So I said, right. He didn't. And I could see the wave of relief flow over my. I mean, I'm serious. It was relief because suddenly the universe made sense again. Yeah. And I know that any Christians that might happen to be listening to the show, and how likely is that? But if any Christian happens to be listening to the show, they're going to say that they don't believe in magic and that miracles are something different. Well, if that's the case, it doesn't really matter because look up miracles. Get a half a dozen different dictionaries. Go to One Look dictionaries or One Look encyclopedia or whatever it is. Just look it up in a number of different sources. Get a half a dozen of them. Look up magic. Look up miracle. If you only look them up in the relevant context, obviously we're not talking about illusionists pulling rabbits out of hats, but if you look it up in the relevant context of what we're talking about, you're going to see that magic and miracle have the same definition.
Right.
They are both the evocation of supernatural forces or entities, including a god, which can be evoked by charms or spells or incantations, including prayers, which are all found in the Bible, to control or forecast natural events in ways that are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of physics.
Yeah.
Essentially, in summary, that is the definition of both magic and miracle. They share the same definition.
They're pretty much interchangeable. Yeah. It's just that magic is the word you use for when other people are doing it. People that are not our people. And then they have varying levels of credence that they give to that. Because, a lot of churches grow up saying magic's not real. Like Ouija boards, that's just silly. Those things don't really work. But then there's others that have a lot thicker magical thinking in the way that they operate. And those churches will be freaked out by the occult and by Halloween and by Ouija boards and horror movies. And they really believe that if you write things on the mirror, that things will jump out at you. And, they just come up with these, they're just very quick to believe urban legends, And again, that wasn't my version of it, but we also talked about magic and we talked about it like it was silly. And, we were skeptics when it came to paranormal activity. So yeah, it's just a matter of saying, well, what if you took that same critical analysis that you use for those things and apply them to your own thing? Really, the word paranormal and the word supernatural is just like the word miracle and magic. They're
assassination versus killing.
I suppose so. Good point. Well, at any rate, yeah, it's semantics. And you teach people to use this word for that kind and this word for that kind. So if I use the word magic, which is an upcoming post, I want to write about magical thinking, because I think that magical thinking is underneath some of the biggest problems of people's faith systems. But as soon as I use that word magic, I know a lot of people are going to shut off. They're going to quit reading the article.
Well, the way I looked at it is if a wealthy person is murdered, then it's an assassination. And if a VIP is murdered,
right,
it's an assassination. If a wealthy person is neurotic, we call them eccentric. And when a god performs magic, he's working miracles.
Right. Well, I saw the same sort of semantic game play out in a video somebody posted today about when white kids riot after a game versus when black kids riot because someone was killed. And the way the news talks about both riots, when it talks about the white kids, it's like, they're being stupid, they're being destructive, they need to go home, they're, out of control. But the words are not the same as the words they use when the black kids are rioting. So there's a double standard there that's just like what we're talking about.
Yeah, we got a whole nother podcast coming up about that one. I've already tried to do one. I'm keen to do another one because the double standard that you're bringing up right now is a sore spot with me. I don't know why. It's just irritating. Yeah. Why is it like, for example, today we hear this story about the Oath Keepers, right? The Oath Keepers are threatening to come down to Kentucky and they're going to defend Kim Davis in case he gets arrested. So they're going to prevent her from being arrested. So what we've got is we've got a team of vigilantes who are saying that they're threatening acts of violence against state employees, right, in order to disobey the law. Right. Now, as somebody pointed out today, these people are extremely right-wing, authoritarian nationalists, which is the definition of fascist, and also then they're threatening to use acts of violence in order to disobey the law and achieve this political goal. Well, then this also is terrorism, but you will never get the word terrorist attached to a white Christian in this country.
Right. It's a double standard. You're right.
It's just enormously frustrating to me that it especially when it's so obvious. Like, what happens when you walk into a church and you kill all the black people in the church? Then the cops take you to get a hamburger. But if you're a little boy sitting on a park bench with a toy gun, they shoot you instantly, and then handcuff your parents and your sister and everybody when they try to help you. That's the double standard. And it's very infuriating to me.
It's very hard to get to them to see it too, because of the privilege blindness.
Yeah,
I've tried to have that discussion with some of my people, and it doesn't seem to work very well because in Mississippi, in the land of privilege there, which granted is a different level of privilege than you get in other places. We have less money than a lot of states, but still the same concept of privilege and the same blindness towards what people live like who are not from your world, and what an unfair and an unbalanced system it is that people are growing up in.
So, as I said, that's going to be another show for another time,
Okay.
and I'm keen to get good guests for that. And I really want to do that one because it's an irritant, but that's not what I wanted to talk to you about, of course.
Okay.
So, I'm really curious about how do you come from this background of I'm always interested in somebody's deconversion stories, but I'm kind of interested in where your mind was prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I really have no point of relation. I mean, if you were talking to Matt Dillahunty, he'd just nod your head because he knows.
Mm-hmm.
I don't.
It's not easy to explain because the processes you go through are not always logical. There's a lot of pretzel logic going on. There's a lot of doing mental gymnastics to make things work in your head. I always say that my entire life, I've always had an inner skeptic. I've always had a side of me that asks questions about things that I'm told to believe, and big questions, metaphysical questions about all of life and how it works and what happens before it and after it, and is there anything outside the universe, and all those big questions. And when I became more fully indoctrinated in the Christian faith, because I was raised in it, I learned to put a lot of those questions aside or to filter them through the way that I was taught as a child. And then I got a lot more into it as a teenager because I had a salvation experience. I had a very emotional experience at a youth evangelism conference. And I threw myself into Bible study and into the Christian symbolic world as heavily as anybody else I knew. I was very much a fanatic about it. And I think I stayed that way for 20 years.
20 years.
Yeah, I was a Christian for 20 years. And pretty much for the majority of that time, I was in some form of leadership capacity or another because I was more passionate about my faith than anybody else around me. And I was drawn to the people who were just like me. So all of my best friends, by the time I deconverted, were all in some kind of ministry, which is part of why I lost all my friends. Because, as kind and as generous as most of them are, you just don't have anything in common if your whole life is built around your ministry. You don't have the same common interests anymore. And if you're not big into sports or whatever, there's not much to talk about.
Yeah, I don't even, my family won't respond to any of my messages anymore.
Right.
Apparently, if we can't talk about football, there's nothing else we can talk about.
Right. And you can't talk about politics. That's going to be a bad idea. So, what happened was, I kept suppressing a lot of questions. It's funny that the Bible ironically talks about suppressing the truth in Romans 1. I feel like that's a lot like what I was doing as a Christian. Every time questions would surface, I would wrestle with them because I wasn't taught that doubt was some sort of radioactive thing you had to run away from. That wasn't my background, I was told that doubt can be embraced and wrestled through. It's just that they didn't tell you that if you wrestled through it hard enough, you sometimes got through it and realized that it discounted what you were taught to believe. That's the part they don't tell you about, because I think most people stop. They wrestle with their doubts, but they always lose to them, and they end up going back to faith because they can't figure out how to work their way through them. I kind of went through different phases. College was a phase because I was studying the Bible more formally, which is always a bad idea. Once you actually study it formally, it causes you to raise questions about it. And it's no wonder why so many of the preachers that are out there talk real negative about higher education, because they know that if you ask really, really hard questions, and if you start reading about the historical backgrounds of what you've been taught, it can dismantle things. That's particularly true if you're a Mormon. As a side note, I just met a friend, Luna, over in, I think it was Seattle a few weeks ago, and she explained how it's getting to be harder for Mormons now because so much of their story hinges on a particular framework that you can actually historically disprove in ways that it's harder to disprove about things that were 2,000 years ago. There's not a lot of stuff getting dug up on a regular basis about Jesus, which is part of why, so many have concluded they don't even think the guy even existed. I personally think he did, but what evidence is there going to be of a peasant who, from that time period? But the Mormon story, on the other hand, Joseph Smith, there's a lot of records you can go look up. There are scans of journal entries written by the wife of Joseph Smith, the young wife, and it talks about how her people talked her through what it was that she was doing when she married him. And I can't even remember all the details, but as she began to explain it to me, I thought, wow, that would be devastating to somebody if your whole religious system is based on a narrative that is recent enough that you can go back and question it. Of course, as a Christian, I didn't have, a more traditional Christian, I didn't have that because, like I said, you can't just go back and find documents from the first century that are going to conclusively disprove a lot of things. It's too long ago. But I had these questions that I asked, and they never really got answered in college, and they didn't really get answered in seminary either. I went to Reformed Seminary, and I appreciate that I did, because I feel like I learned a little bit better how to study the Bible. But I'll give you an example. Okay, so as a Christian early on, I was very drawn to the idea of a graceful framework for understanding the gospel. For some people, it's all about law and legalism. You do this and don't do this. But I was from the grace camp that was more into talking about freedom in Christ, and it's his kindness that leads you to repentance. That was the sunnier side of evangelicalism that I was drawn to. And when we read the Gospels, the Pharisees were these bad guys. It's like every time they came up, you'd want to boo and hiss, because the Pharisees were the ultimate foil to who Jesus was, right? They were legalists. They were obsessed with minutia and details and following the law. Well, that's
where the devil is.
Right. That's
where the devil is.
Yeah,
the devil
right. Exactly. Right. And so, you have this construct that works, that grace is what God's about, and law is this thing he's fighting against, and it kind of fits with the system. But then I started studying the first century formally, and what you'll find is, even among the conservative theologians and Bible scholars, the concept of the Pharisee is completely off in the Bible. It's completely fictitious. There were Pharisees, but the way they're represented in the New Testament is a caricature that you cannot find in first century literature outside of the Gospels.
How so?
Well, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi library, we have access to a lot more documents that talk about the way that they thought, the way that they taught their religious beliefs in the first century. That's called Second Temple Judaism. And we learned from that time period that they were a lot more graceful than we thought. They had a lot more well-developed, well-rounded approach to their religion that doesn't look as much unlike Christianity later on as we were led to believe. And this two-dimensional villain that Jesus is always fighting against in the New Testament, it just doesn't even seem to have existed. Outside of the Gospels, you can't find examples of these things. There was a guy named, what is his name? Sanders, E.P. Sanders. And I think he teaches at Duke now. E.P. Sanders in the late 70s published a book about Paul and Rabbinic Judaism. And he said, basically, everything we've been taught about Pharisees is wrong. It's a caricature. It's an exaggeration. It's a straw man, basically.
I always had kind of the same impression about the story about when Jesus goes out into the desert and Satan is there trying to talk him out of his faith. The way that Satan does this thing, where he says, okay, if you'll renounce that you're the Son of God, I'll give you all this land. Well, why would anybody who knows God and is talking to someone who knows God say something so stupid? How could that? Obviously, this conversation can't have really happened. This is a caricature conversation as well. Even if the characters were real, that conversation still can't be.
Right. There's a lot of that in the Bible. I agree. I just didn't know the Pharisees would be. And what struck me was how the people that I was reading, they weren't liberals. These were conservatives. These were evangelical scholars that were having to admit, wait a minute, the Pharisees were nothing like what we thought, which means there's at least something in the New Testament that we can say for certain does not match the way things were. Even among the conservative scholars, they have to admit it. So one of the most eminent scholars today among evangelicals is a guy named N.T. Wright. He was the bishop of, I think, Canterbury, archbishop or whatever. I can't remember what his final title was. He's retired now, but he is one of the most, authoritative scholars on first century thinking at this point among evangelicals. And he admits that, everything changed in the late 70s about how we study Second Temple Judaism after we got those documents and we went through them and realized this is nothing like the way the Bible talks about them. So N.T. Wright has had to go back through and reinterpret all of Paul's letters from a more social standpoint. So, like, take, for example, the book of Galatians. I don't know how well you know the book of Galatians, but that was a fascination of mine when I was in school. And the book of Galatians is all about law versus grace. And the big controversy is whether or not the Jews or the Gentiles are supposed to get circumcised. Well, the way that I understood that, it all had to do with this giant, cosmic battle between legalism and grace. But N.T. Wright went back and looked at it and said, no, this really has to do with how to draw the boundary line around the people of God. Are they all going to be Jews, and do they have to follow the Jewish law, or is it going to be more inclusive than that to include Gentiles? So it was more of an ethnic question. It was a social question, not a theological question or a religious question. And so even the conservatives have had to acknowledge this, but it doesn't filter down out of academia into the pulpit, which is something that Bart Ehrman talks about a lot. The people that study in seminary learn these things, but because there's no pastoral application, it's not like you can get in your pulpit and talk about these things. I mean, can you imagine a conservative, like a Baptist preacher, getting up in front of his congregation and saying, all these places where the Pharisees are saying these things and Jesus is calling them whitewashed tombstones and broods of vipers, that probably didn't exactly happen like that. He's going to get thrown out of his church. They're not going to accept that.
There is an example of that actually happened. It was Rabbi David Wolpe in round about Y2K. He gave a Passover sermon in which he told his congregation that every
Exodus never happened.
Exactly.
Yes, which is absolutely true. I got a lot of flack for the fact that I admitted that I'm not a mythicist when it comes to Jesus. I actually think he probably existed. I just don't think he was anything like the way people are presenting him, and I don't think he was magic. But I think he was probably a real guy that layers of legend have been put on top of. Well, that really ticked off a lot of people who disagreed with me. But when you go farther back and you start talking about some of the Old Testament stuff, I actually am more of a mythicist because the claims are bigger. It's not much of a claim that there was this one peasant rabbi that traveled in this small backwoods place and taught for a while. That there wouldn't be a whole lot of artifacts left behind for that. But you want to talk about something like 2 or 3 million people that were supposed to leave out of Egypt at a certain time, and they would have left stuff everywhere, and they were supposed to be in an area for 40 years. And we can go to those places and dig them up and say, you know what, we've gone 4 levels below in the dirt where they were supposed to have lived there, and there's nothing there. We can conclusively say none of that story was right.
No, I've interviewed Frank Zimmer, David Fitzgerald, Richard Carrier, D.M. Murdoch, Robert Price, and I used to have the this impression that there was an actual guy on which all the legends were based, just as you were saying. But after listening to all these guys with their separate arguments, by the way, everybody had different arguments for this. I'm now of the same opinion. I mean, I'm sorry that somebody got pissed off at you for this. I mean, I would want to, bring up what my argument or what my position is. I thought once upon a time that the whole thing about cursing the fig tree, that that this is something that the things that imply that Jesus is real are the identical things that also imply that Jesus could not have been a god. But like David Fitzgerald said, but even the location of where that tree is a parable in itself. So,
yep. No,
and I don't want to. I don't know what it was. I've done 5 other shows on mythicism. So, but I want to. Yeah, there was something else I wanted to ask you, and I saw a post somewhere, maybe it was a tweet, where Sarah Moorhead said something along the lines of you being one of the most important voices in atheism today.
Wow.
What is she talking about?
I don't know what she's talking about. Well, my answer to that is going to be inclusive of what she is doing and what Recovering from Religion is doing.
Okay.
Sarah had a talk with Richard Dawkins not too long ago, and I think it's safe to share the conversation that he said, what you're doing at Recovering from Religion is one of the most important things that's happening in the secularist movement. And I think I know why he said that. It's because the ground has already been broken. There's already been a path that's been made through culture in America and in some cases in Britain as well. And as with any movement, the firebrands tend to be the pathfinders. They tend to lead the way in stirring things up. And over time, with any movement, there tends to be a second wave that comes along behind the pathfinders and begins to build things on top of the ground they've cleared. It requires a certain kind of voice that's a more positive, constructive, diplomatic, maybe even bridge building voice, because in the constructive phase, you've got to find your allies. Instead of necessarily making enemies and burning bridges, you're actually building some bridges to people, trying to figure out who's going to help you accomplish what your common goals are. And recovering from religion is in one of those places where we are actually trying to help people who are still transitioning out of their faith. We're not telling them what to believe. We're not telling them to transition out. They're coming to us because they're already 2/3 of the way, and what they're doing is they're needing somebody to talk to. And what recovering can do is they can actually listen to their stories and listen with empathy, like you said, because we've been in the same place as they are. And some of us can even go into a church and we could talk with pastors, and we could, some of us have done interviews where we've sat down with pastors in front of their churches and we've said, why don't you ask us questions and see if you understand where it is that we're coming from. And again, this is not a debate setting. It's more of just saying, you might misunderstand us, and who knows, maybe we misunderstand you. So why don't we work on our communication skills by sitting and talking through some of our differences? So this is kind of that diplomatic approach. And I think that because some of us know how to speak Baptist, we know how to speak Pentecostal, we know how to speak these different vocabularies because we came out of them, we can actually get a hearing with some of these people. We know where all the minefields are. We know which topics to avoid because they're not going to be constructive. And a lot of times when you're trying to talk to somebody who is from a highly developed worldview, if you don't have the right turn of phrase, they're not going to listen to you. They can tell if you really know their world very well, and they'll shut you off really soon if you don't have the right combination of words. So that's why I say we speak Baptist, and so I think what she said about having an important voice is those of us that have come out of a very religious background, we know how to identify with those people, and there are more of them there than there are of the rest of us out here. And that's why it's so important to be able to get to them and to identify them and to create some sort of a pathway out for them if that's what they're looking for. So like, for example, one of the projects that Recovering does is the Hotline Project. And we always push that because it's been one of the most successful things that Recovering's done. It's been a way to create a place for people to talk when they don't have anywhere else to talk, they don't have anybody else to talk to.
I was going to ask about that. It sounded like you were having something along the lines of like a suicide hotline kind of thing somewhere.
It's like that. It's 184 I doubt it. And
okay.
184 I doubt it. And before long, we've got a plan to get a little bit more exposure for the phone number. It's already been covered on CNN and Huffington Post and a few places, but we want to get it out there for larger groups of Christians to see, because there's a lot of people who are still in their religious background, but they don't have anybody to talk to. And we get phone calls. During the first month, there were like 1,000 calls. And, it's hard to even keep up with all of them. And they're all being recorded. And there's very strict guidelines about how people talk through these questions, because we're not proselytizing. We're not trying to get people to move from this point to this point. We're just listening to them, which in and of itself is validating what they're saying. And that's something nobody else is doing for them. And if they come to us with problems that are bigger than what we are equipped to handle, then we escalate things and we move them to the next stage, which, for example, if they're suicidal, we have a hotline that we send them to because we're not equipped to do that. Maybe they're going through marital difficulties or some sort of psychological baggage that they need to work through. We'll refer them to the Secular Therapist Project, which is another thing that Recovering does. So there's all these different things that we have going on. And my job as of the last week or two is going to be to develop the groups for Recovering from Religion, some of the small local groups that gather in real life, in real time, to talk about what they're going through. And there's nearly a couple of hundred of those at this point that are either already formed or in the process of forming. So since I come from a background that's really big on small group dynamics, because I was a part of a home church movement for about 10 years, that's something I'm really passionate about, is having people find ways to get together with each other. But that's hard. If you're from a highly religious area, it's hard to even find each other.
It's good that you know how to speak this language, because I clearly don't. This is my weakest area, really. One of my old employers recently invited me to come to his church, for example, and I asked, "Why do you go to church?" And he gave me these answers, which were all completely empty, including, I mean, from my perspective, they're completely empty.
Right.
One of them being where you sit and listen to the lesson to reaffirm your faith, which translates in my head as, convince yourself against reality. It couldn't be any more dishonest. It couldn't be any more fruitless.
Well, I would call it insecure. I'll give a good example of that. One of my local high schools in my school district here has been in the news lately because the band tried to play a famous Christian hymn. It's How Great Thou Art. And Hemet posted about it, and I posted about it on Godless and Dixie. And basically, the band was not only going to play How Great Thou Art as their featured piece during the halftime show, but at one point during the performance, they were going to line up in the form of a cross. And then at the end of the performance, they were to all end on one knee with their heads bowed, which is a really overt display of religious favoritism for a public school. But in Rankin County, Mississippi, this is something they're becoming legendary for. This is a battle that they want to fight, and it's a hill they want to die on. And they've already had to give up money for it because the American Humanist Association has had to say, you know what? Not everybody in your school is a Christian. You've got Buddhists, you've got Hindus, you've got
people that still have some sense.
You just have a lot of different kinds of people, and you cannot force them to, ascribe, some sort of credence to this by making them watch this. And what if your kid's in band and he's a Buddhist and he's got to get in the form of a cross and act like he's praying to the How Great Thou Art? So they were told not to do that. And that infuriated the community. So what happened was, even though it was the school board that made the decision to nix the number, everybody in the community began taking shoe polish and writing How Great Thou Art all over their cars. And that was about 3 weeks ago. And everywhere I go in my community, I'm still seeing How Great Thou Art on half the cars that are around. And sometimes they'll put a Bible verse on the side as well, but usually just How Great Thou Art. And I remember thinking, first of all, how insecure would you have to be that it deeply upsets you that your public high school in a pluralistic country can't, have this overt display of sectarian favoritism. But also, even the How Great Thou Art is like, I don't want to get too much into this, but what does it say about you if you have to constantly remind yourself and the person you're praying to that he exists and that he's important and that he's awesome? And half the praise and worship songs that they sing are essentially telling God things about him that he's supposed to know. And over and over and over again, and you start to ask yourself, who are you saying this for? Yeah,
that's the way it always struck me, though. I mean, it always seems like they're convincing themselves. And one group told me like this. He said that they described it as eating the word, where they would gather together in somebody's house and they would all read these passages and just make themselves believe it, no matter how ridiculous it was. That's what they called eating the word.
Wait, where was that?
No, this was 20 years ago. It was around Y2K.
Was that West Coast? I'm just wondering.
I can't remember now. It's been too long.
That's a peculiar phrase, and I encountered that a lot in one of the church groups that I was a part of, and that's why it caught my attention. Of course, there is this notion that the Bible itself is food for your, for your spirit. That by hearing the words and speaking the words, again, it's magic. That's why I often have to do my talk about how quoting Bible verses doesn't work like a Jedi mind trick. And a lot of my friends seem to think that it does, that if you can just get the words said out loud, that things are going to happen to people, even to people like me who have studied it for decades and have studied it more deeply and more formally than any of them have. But just by hearing the words again, something's going to magically happen to me. That's kind of a weird belief, but they've been taught to believe that.
Maybe you skipped over that verse.
Clearly, I have not. I could probably read it in Hebrew and Greek, but that doesn't matter to them. The point is, they believe that it's magic. They believe that if you hear the words one more time, something, I almost wonder if they don't almost imagine sparkles appearing above your head. I wonder sometimes if they imagine special effects around what's happening. One time I was at a wedding, and a friend of mine was performing the wedding. And when it came time for him to say the final words, he put his hand out, and he did this thing with his hand. And I remember thinking, why are you putting your hand out right now? Do you imagine like something shooting out of it? I mean, it's a gesture, and I know why he's doing it, but I almost wonder if there isn't some sort of a sense that something's flowing through his body right now. It's very magical thinking. Same thing with putting your hands on people when you pray for them. That's very magical thinking.
Well, I got to tell you, I wasn't expecting that this interview would flow quite as nicely and be as informative as it did. You're very rich on the information. We've already closed an hour.
Have we?
Yep. I'm surprised, and I could continue on for a while, and I would like to actually, but I need to ask you in the last few minutes: was there anything you need to get out before it's over?
There is. I already mentioned the Hotline Project, and that's one of the most important things that we've got going on. 184, I doubt it. But in order to operate the Hotline Project, there has to be money to pay for the servers. In fact, all of these projects that Recovering from Religion is doing, the groups, the Secular Therapist Project, and the Hotline Project, there does have to be some money put into it to make these things work. You pay for the servers, you pay for the licenses. At some point, we're going to try to advertise what we're doing so that more Christians can hear about the Hotline. So we started a fundraiser about 3 weeks ago on Indiegogo, and you can see it on Godless and Dixie. It's just a couple of posts back, and maybe I can send you a link to it or something.
Yeah, make sure that we'll put links, because this is going to go up on YouTube as soon as we're done. Right. So we'll make sure that there's
be sure to put the Indiegogo link. That fundraiser is still running. The initial stated purpose for the fundraiser was to cover essentially 3 months of me working with groups with recovering. It ended up bringing in 6 months worth, and that's just the way it rolled out with designated gifts. But at this point, everything that comes in above that doesn't go to what I'm doing. It goes to everything else that Recovering is doing. Sarah is a good example of somebody who is constantly traveling around promoting what Recovering is doing, but there's really not any financial support for her up until this point. She's been volunteer for the last 4 or 5 years doing what she's doing. I know, wow is really the only proper response to that. So we need to get the rest of what Recovering is doing funded so that she can keep doing what she's doing and do it bigger. So that's the main thing I want to leave you with is I'd love to see that link go up so that folks can know that there's still a need for people to give in order to contribute to what Recovering's doing. There's a lot left to be done.
Okay, well, I will make sure to include the links.
Thank you.
And what are you yourself? You're fundraising for Recovering from Religion, and you're also, what else are you doing there? I forgot.
For Recovering?
Yes.
Well, okay, so Recovering is the main job that I'm doing. I'm working as the group development director for Recovering. And just out of necessity, I'm also doing some organizational development for them, working on future fundraising in order to get everything taken care of that needs to be done. But Sarah is also president of the Reason Rally. And one of the things I'm doing for the Reason Rally, which is coming up June 4th, by the way, of next year, I think you probably heard that announcement, or maybe you didn't, but it's June 4th. And so one of the things I'm doing for that is I'm writing some of the content for the website, and I'm getting to talk about what the rally's about and do some stories about the people who are contributing to the rally and who are contributing to the movement as a whole. So I get to kind of show up at some of these events too and talk to some of the people who are involved in the movement in general. And that's been exciting because I've gotten to meet a lot of really cool people that way. So when you see me around, that's what it's for.
The last Reason Rally, it was done, I guess, primarily by American atheists. They had me and a couple of other people doing the promo videos. Nobody's asked me about doing that yet, but I would love to promote that event.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, they've got a lot of irons going all at the same time. There's still a lot of details that haven't been worked out yet because we've invited a lot of people especially people who are very big in the science world and in the entertainment world, and we can't give any names yet because we're waiting to get confirmation from them. So it's still in the early stages of promotion, but now that we finally can admit the date, now we can kind of do a lot more stuff and quit keeping so many secrets.
All right. Well, very good. I will see you at Aposticon.
Excellent.
And I'm going to go ahead and close out the show. Neil Carter, thank you very much for being on.
Thank you. My pleasure.